If history is written by the victors, what perspective of WW2 could have been written a little one-sided? USSR got a lot of slack. For a lot of Eastern Europe, WW2 was evil versus lesser evil, one colonial empire replaced by another. Even now the Soviet invasion of Poland and Finland are glossed over, especially in Russia. America usually gets portrayed as the selfless nation joining the war to free Europe from the Nazis. In reality, America had a lot of people that were open to trying fascism as well, and they only joined the war once they became concerned that the Axis powers were dangerous to them personally. After that happened, there was obviously a lot of propaganda to make sure everyone knew the fascists were supposed to be the bad guys. And after the first concentration camps were freed, I'm sure many were absolutely horrified and started to see it as their main goal to end the Holocaust. But it still wasn't the original objective. People tend to gloss over the fact that the US had concentration camps and forcibly relocated over 125,000 people into these camps for years. The mass bombing of civilians was okay and morally just. Necessary? Maybe. But we don't need to pretend that it was a good thing. CU's all that did was let people justify bombing civilians today. Flattening entire cities for a terror effect is not a cool thing to do. It happened on the Eastern Front. Most of our accounts of the Eastern Front were from old Nazi generals. The Russians weren't exactly helpful in the Cold War. We only had brief access to the Russian archives in the late 90s. And those records had to survive generations of culling. Yeah, it's mostly right, except Stalin was just as bad as Hitler and in some cases worse. Not to diminish Hitler's horrific and inhuman lunacy, the Japanese military also probably stands shoulder to shoulder with the Germans for atrocities in China and Korea. The coverage of the Allied bombing campaigns on Germany and Japan are very much glossed over compared to their Axis counterparts. Those campaigns targeted civilians just as much as the other side did, and yet the fact that those campaigns would now be labeled as war crimes are never acknowledged as such. The US basically whitewashed Emperor Hirohito and the imperial family's culpability in Japanese war crimes and crimes against humanity, keeping him as a figurehead in order to facilitate a peaceful Allied occupation. Hirohito was not merely presented as being innocent of any formal acts that might make him culpable to indictment as a war criminal, he was turned into an almost saintly figure who did not even bear moral responsibility for the war. Instead, the ultimate blame was largely shifted to Hideki Tojo. See Dresden bombing. Dropping nuclear weapons on cities was good. Probably the firebombing of Tokyo. It was the single deadliest night in human history, surpassing Hiroshima or Nagasaki on their own, that is, not combined. The temperature in Tokyo reached nearly half the temperature of the surface of the sun. The odor of 100,000 burnt Japanese dead was so powerful that even American bomber crews flying at 7,000 feet could smell it very clearly. The idea that the Allies cared about human rights or Jews getting killed. They famously rejected many Jewish refugees, and there are plenty of stories of British doctors working in mental wards doing fucked up experiments on mentally ill people. They cared about Germany, a hostile power, being expansionist and threatening the balance of power in Europe. History is not written by the victors, and WW2 is probably the best example of that thesis. Almost everything I mean Western First World historiography knew from the Eastern Front during WW2 was written by Nazi sex Nazis, aka the losers of the conflict. All the shit about the clean Wehrmacht and the SS being the only ones to commit atrocities, the Soviets using human wave tactics and blaming every blunder on Hitler and other important but also conveniently dead at the time of writing Nazi officials came from ex-Wehrmacht senior officers, like Guderian and Manstein. This massively warped our understanding of the conflict that only disappeared with the fall of the USSR and the opening of its archives. So when the USSR finally lost by breaking up, they got to correct the previously one-sided, Nazi-written historiography. So no, History is not written by the victors, it's written by the historians, independently of the side they used to be on. If you ask the British, we won WW2 all by ourselves. Also, the Bengal famine is never mentioned here despite it being a massive crime of the UK where millions died because of British rule. Yeah, it's mostly right, except Stalin was just as bad as Hitler and in some cases worse. Not to diminish Hitler's horrific and inhuman lunacy, the Japanese military also probably stands shoulder to shoulder with the Germans for atrocities in China and Korea.